Hello and welcome to Connected With Latham, where we discuss ideas, legal developments and business trends shaping the global economy. I'm Rob Moulton, the Vice Chair of Latham's Financial Institutions Group and Financial Regulation Practice and a partner in our London office. In this episode, we're going to talk about corporate culture and particularly the practical steps that companies can take to measure and monitor their cultural direction of travel in a meaningful way. This is a topic we've been advising clients on increasingly over the last decade as it has become an area of focus for regulators, investors, and the wider public. As part of this work, we've developed a culture framework which seeks to bridge the theory and practice divide and translate the nebulous concept of culture into something more tangible and practical. And with me today are the fabulous authors of that framework: David Berman, a financial regulatory partner in our London office; Nell Perks, an associate in our London office; and I'm also joined by Nathan Seltzer, a partner in our London office and vice chair of our white collar defence and investigations practice. Thank you all for joining me. So, culture is often thought of as a bit of an amorphous subject. What is it, and why is it receiving so much attention at the moment?
Perhaps I'll start. It's David Berman here. I think culture is often seen as an inherently nebulous concept, but that doesn't mean that it can't be measured or monitored in practice. There is no single sort of right or wrong way in which to do that. But one of the reasons why we developed our culture framework was specifically to assist firms and institutions and corporates to get something of a practical handle around this nebulous concept of corporate culture by reference to various metrics, some more tangible measures that firms can use, measure and monitor over time. Culture is often regarded as or defined as the way we do things here. It's also defined as what we do when nobody's looking and various variations of that sort of theme. So there isn't a sort of hard, concrete definition of it as such. It's certainly been something of a priority for the UK FCA for some time now, and I think that's very well known and understood. In short, the FCA considers that the underlying conduct and cultural failings were a significant root cause of the global banking crisis and indeed other high-profile city scandals. So I think it's fair to say that the FCA has therefore led the way to a large degree in the context of culture and conduct, and in particular conduct risk. That said, many other national regulators and influential international bodies have increasingly recognised the importance of culture, corporate culture, and will now regard it as a key priority.
And Nate, how's it being looked at in the US?
David is absolutely correct. In the US, there is an increasing focus on culture, including from the US Department of Justice, the criminal prosecutors, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, which enforces the US federal securities laws civilly, not to mention the United States Congress, which has made culture an issue when holding hearings about a number of high-profile corporate scandals. In particular, the DOJ's guidance in its evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which is a guide for prosecutors making criminal charging decisions, notes the importance of a culture of ethics and compliance. And that guidance sets out detailed questions for prosecutors to ask companies, including how often the company measures its culture and what steps the company has taken in response to its measurement of its compliance culture.
And so it sounds as though, David, this is much broader than just financial services.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been an awful lot of focus on corporate culture within the financial services industry, both here in the UK, in the US, and in various other jurisdictions too, all of which, by the way, are referenced in our framework. But of course, the importance of corporate culture reaches way beyond just the financial services industry. I would argue that it's industry neutral and it's also jurisdiction neutral. So frankly, any form of corporate institution or firm, company, call it what you will, Corporate culture is an incredibly important element of their ongoing sort of day-to-day way of doing things. Interestingly, what we are seeing is a greater focus, for example, by corporate acquirers in M&A processes or private equity firms that are looking to acquire portfolio companies, for example. Whether or not that target happens to operate in the financial institution space, we're seeing an increasing focus on corporate culture. So, for example, and I think we can all probably think of concrete examples of cases where acquisitions have been made and where the acquirer quite quickly post-acquisition realizes that they've not bought what they thought they bought because, in certain instances, they've gone and bought a toxic culture. And, of course, that hasn't shown up during the due diligence efforts, perhaps unsurprisingly, because they weren't asking the right questions during the due diligence exercise. And again, that's a shift that we are starting to see, that prospective acquirers are now asking questions within the due diligence programs around corporate culture. So we're looking at things like, for example, whistleblow statistics, exit interview data, complaints data, employee turnover data, and various other metrics too. Similarly, for listed companies, public companies, again, in most jurisdictions, including the US and the UK, there is an increasing focus from a corporate governance perspective on the monitoring and measurement of corporate culture. Indeed, just by way of an example, the Financial Reporting Council, which oversees listed companies here in the UK, has a dedicated paper entitled Corporate Culture and the Role of Boards. Alongside that, and I think it's fair to say as a direct result of the pandemic, we are seeing a greater focus on corporate culture through an ESG lens, in particular through the society and governance limbs of ESG, with more stakeholders now focusing upon corporate culture, and including in the context of the pandemic. How did this firm actually respond to the pandemic? Was this a firm, for example, that tried to screw as much out of its supply chain as possible, taking advantage of the particular circumstances? Or conversely, was this a firm which actually tried to pivot and do the right thing, treat its employees properly, ensure their welfare and everything else, and make life as easy as possible for them? Or was it something in between?
So if the pandemic can affect culture, sounds like culture isn't fixed. Good cultures could turn bad, bad cultures could be improved. How do corporations look at making sure their culture is on the right trajectory?
It's a great question, and it's something that we seek to at least provide some answers to within our culture framework. I think it's important to recognise that culture is much more of an art than it is a science, and we all need to recognise that. And cultures do change, and cultures will evolve over time, and within any organisation there are likely to be multiple subcultures. So we have to recognise that. That having been said, that is not the reason alone not to at least try to monitor cultural trajectory or direction of travel over time. So what we are seeing, for example, one very commonly employed technique these days is the use of employee engagement surveys. A lot of institutions use those. But what we're seeing now in particular is a revisiting of the questions that are being included in those surveys to ensure that they are driving at the right sorts of points and designed to flush out the right sorts of sentiments, culture-related sentiments. But that alone isn't going to be enough. It's obviously then important that the results of those surveys are properly and objectively scrutinised, that they are seen in their proper context, they are not rose-tinted, but also that then provides a basis for year-on-year comparisons. So you can ask the same question the following year, you can look at the response rate, you can see if you're moving in the right direction. I'm not suggesting that that's the be-all and the end-all, but it's just one of many ways in which firms can at least attempt meaningfully to monitor their cultural direction of travel. They can also do it by reference to a whole host of other metrics, some of which we've already referenced, like complaints, whistleblowers, employee turnover, employee escalations, and the like.
So Nell, tell us about practical steps people can take.
So one of the things that we've seen being used and making a real difference is where firms have regular conduct and values training to ensure that all the employees are absolutely clear on how they should behave and what's expected of them. One thing we've seen deployed particularly successfully is a kind of scenario-based training where employees are presented with realistic scenarios that they might come across in their daily work, but which present grey situations or thorny issues, difficult decisions they may have to make. And that can be really effective in giving them the opportunity to discuss and consider how they would and how they should respond. This sort of thing is most effective where the training is given on a regular basis and continually adapts to the changing circumstances. And if you do that, we've seen that you can really help ensure that all the relevant points are in people's minds and at the front of their minds as they're carrying out their work every day. And hopefully you can start to gain some confidence that when in real life somebody is faced with those sorts of difficult decisions, they're equipped to deal with them and take into account all the factors that they should be taking into account. Another of the values actually in giving this sort of regular culture training is that it can be really helpful in maintaining your cultural trajectory as your workforce changes, with various people leaving the company and new recruits joining. We've seen that making sure that new recruits and lateral hires are effectively integrated is absolutely essential. And if you don't pay enough attention to that, it can cause problems as you start to develop a them and us culture, and it can sort of give rise to a lack of inclusion. And in fact, even before that, we found that the approach that a company can take to recruitment can have a significant effect on its culture. We've seen, most recruitment processes tend to be more focused on a candidate's technical expertise, which is obviously very important. But if you think that it's important for people in your organisation to have the right kind of values and ethics, then really it makes sense that you should be testing their values and ethics in just the way you are their other abilities to carry out the work and make sure they can do their job effectively.
And so is that realistic, Nate, to think that people can find that? Do we have clients who think we have a bad culture, we always knew that?
I certainly hope not. And I hope that we're able to help those clients get their cultures going on the right trajectory. But it's important that all companies think about the data available to them and the analysis they can do from that data to improve their cultures. As a white-collar and investigations lawyer, I'm often brought in to investigate when something has gone wrong. And many times when dealing with a general counsel or a chief compliance officer at the outset of the investigation, notwithstanding the concerning allegations that may have been raised through a whistleblower report or otherwise, I often hear that the client is surprised because they have a really positive culture and they feel like employees want to do the right thing. And I wonder, and I often do ask, how do you know that? What's the objective basis for that belief? What data have you reviewed and what analysis have you done around culture? And if we were ever before the government and had to demonstrate that, what data and what information would you rely upon?
If I may just jump in there, I mean, Nate's just hit on a good point. And for me, this is one of the sort of killer questions for any CEO of any institution, right? The question is, tell us what you do on an ongoing basis to monitor and measure your cultural direction of travel. Okay, so every CEO will likely tell you that they have a good culture and that they aspire to maintain a good culture. But if you actually turn that question back and say, okay, so tell us what you're doing in practice to ensure that that is actually the case, to ensure that your culture is being maintained and indeed enhanced and going in the right direction. What in practice are you actually doing?
Yeah, and I think that's actually where once you're measuring your culture, you can really start to add value by not just measuring it in the same way each time, but monitoring it to ensure that you are heading in the right direction and that the company hasn't fallen into that trap, which David was just saying, of saying, oh, look, we've got a good culture, and not carrying on to take the steps to maintain it. You need to keep evaluating changes or areas where they've been changed critically and effectively. And as we keep saying, it's not just a question of looking at the numbers and walking away from them, but carrying on to reflect on what the data shows. So, for example, if you have a positive move in one area and a negative move in another, it's really important for companies to look at that and think, why is that happening? It may be that some of the positive steps that you've taken in one area actually have led to poorer performance in another. And then you can consider whether you should be doing something to address the balance and how you can best address the balance. Because the point we keep making again is that culture is dynamic. And so the approach that companies take to their culture really has to be dynamic as well and keep pace with those sorts of changes.
I agree with David and Nell on that point. And it's not only important because of culture for its own sake, but as I mentioned earlier, the DOJ guidance specifically asks prosecutors not only how the company measures its culture, but what it did in response to the information it learned from that measurement. And so regulators now and prosecutors now want to see not only the focus on culture, but there's meaningful action in response to issues that are identified, good or bad.
I'd echo that. Certainly actions speak louder than words in the eyes of the authorities. That's absolutely true. I think just going back to Nell's point about having to be agile and moving with the developments, the COVID again is another great example of that. With the vast majority of firms' workforces working remotely, that has thrown up a whole host of questions relating to culture, including how do we maintain our culture? In a situation where everybody's working remotely, how do we ensure that we keep that glue, the so-called glue between our employees, the collegiality, the sense of belonging and all of those good things? And indeed, we've seen some very good examples where clients have really gone out of their way and gone to great lengths to ensure the culture will not deteriorate. And in fact, in some cases, I think it's fair to say it's got even stronger through the efforts that they've taken. But conversely, we've also seen some examples at the other end of the spectrum where, frankly, firms have taken their eye off the ball and corporate culture has been one thing that's been allowed to slip. And that, of course, is rather unfortunate and may indeed lead to some unfortunate consequences.
Nell, tell us what the FCA has been saying in the UK on that home working topic.
So the FCA published an excellent paper focusing on some of the challenges that have arisen in working from home and also some of the advantages that it can present. And one thing that it really highlighted, and they've highlighted in various speeches since, is the importance of focusing on diversity and inclusion. COVID-19 hasn't had the same effect on everyone. As several people have said in newspapers and other places, we're in the same storm, but not the same boat. And this means that a one-size-fits-all approach just isn't appropriate and isn't going to succeed. You really need to bear in mind the different challenges that everybody is facing. Having said that, however, it really is an excellent opportunity for companies to recommit to diversity and to make more progress. Diversity is essential for all companies so that they can avoid groupthink and ensure that all the difficult decisions they have to make are tackled by people from a wide range of backgrounds with different experience so that they can lead to better outcomes. And actually, although current and evolving work patterns may make diversity and inclusion challenging, there are ways in which they can make it better. So, for example, when a large proportion of your workforce is working from home, it may be much easier for those with family commitments or who observe different religious festivals and practices to actually participate in the same way as everybody else. I think it's really a question of focusing on the opportunities that you get and using them to overcome the new challenges. And another area in which we've seen this, in which the FCA have been focusing on, is in terms of psychological safety and how you can make sure that people still feel confident in speaking up and challenging when they don't have the day-to-day face-to-face interactions with others that may make it seem more natural. And I think this is something that we may see is exacerbated, actually, as some people start to return to the office and some people are working from home, and you have a kind of hybrid working environment. And that could potentially create a them and us culture where people do feel a bit less psychologically safe. But again, the changing working environment really presents an opportunity for leaders in companies to think a bit more creatively about how they can encourage people to speak up and feel confident that that is what they should be doing and that's what they'll be supported in doing.
So, David, what are the implications of that hybrid working model as we return to offices?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I can't give you all the answers, but I think it's certainly something that all firms will need to start thinking about. I think it's probably fair to say that going forward, certainly for the foreseeable future, a significantly greater proportion of the workforce will be working remotely than was the case pre-pandemic. What that will result in turn, as you say, is essentially a hybrid working environment where at any given time, a good section of your employees are in the office, but also a good section are working remotely from home or or elsewhere. And that in and of itself will present challenges for organizations. Just one that immediately springs to mind is around ensuring fair work allocation, for example. If the sense is that it's only really the people that are staying in the office who are getting the good work and the lion's share of the good work being delegated to them, and that those who are working remotely are basically out of sight and out of mind, I can see that becoming problematic for institutions if they don't take measures to ensure that doesn't in fact happen. And I think they can take measures to ensure that it doesn't happen, but they've got to sort of proactively go and do that. I think also some of the home working risks which came to the fore during the pandemic, they are not going to disappear. Okay, so for example, containment of sensitive information. If you are routinely dealing with inside or sensitive information, you have to take even greater care, perhaps if you're working at home, that it's not inadvertently overseen or overheard or whatever the case may be. And just ensuring that your internal processes and procedures are suitable for both a remote working environment and also an office working environment. That may require in practice you having two slightly different variants of the same policy, applicable depending on whether or not the individual's in the office or at home, for example.
So out of work conduct, to what extent do companies need to take into account out of work conduct when thinking about their culture and when thinking about disciplinary action? David first.
That's a fantastic question. And it's one where I think it's fair to say there's probably something of a divergence of views, not only here in the UK, but also sort of in the US as well. I spent some time earlier this year in the US talking to various clients and audiences about this very topic. Our regulator here in the UK has taken the view that out of work misconduct, whether that takes place or what they call non-financial misconduct that doesn't technically relate to your day job, whether that non-financial misconduct takes place in the office or indeed outside of the office, the UK regulator has taken the view that that is potentially relevant to both it and to the employer. And it's therefore something which may need to be thrown into the mix when assessing that individual's continuing eligibility to act in the financial services industry. So, for example, if somebody has committed a fraud or somebody has committed a criminal offence outside of work, that is likely to be relevant, in the regulator's eyes at least, to that individual's ongoing fitness and propriety. That said, it doesn't automatically follow that any minor indiscretion out of work will automatically be relevant. For example, I've got 3 points on my driving licence, I got caught speeding. That is unlikely to meet the test and satisfy the test. The problem is that there's no hard red line. But increasingly, certainly in the UK, there's been a sense that non-financial misconduct, including that takes place outside of the office, is in fact relevant.
It's a very interesting question and a question that elicits a wide range of views. I think there's a growing consensus that out-of-work conduct can be relevant, but a divergence of views on how relevant and how much an employer should take it into account when making employment decisions, ranging from providing someone with informal feedback to formal discipline. In focus groups and client discussions that I've done, including with U.S. clients, there's sometimes a hesitancy to have workplace discipline for conduct that occurs outside of work. But I found as you start getting into particular scenarios, when you start talking about, in particular, people in leadership positions, there's a recognition that outside of work conduct can very much so impact the company's culture. Each situation, I think, however, has to be evaluated on its specific facts.
And David, what does our culture framework say about this?
Oh gosh, it says rather a lot about this, and we don't have enough time to cover it. So I think the key message is I'd advise everybody to read it cover to cover. But joking aside, I think the importance of non-financial misconduct, including that it features prominently within training programs, internal training programs, it is certainly something that the framework does focus on and emphasize. And, as Nate has alluded to, it sometimes doesn't lend itself to easy solutions. But nevertheless, you can often have tricky tensions between employment law, regulation, reputational risk management, and the like. I don't think it's going away. And I say that because actually the number of whistleblowers generally is increasing. And within that statistic, the number of whistleblowers relating to alleged non-financial misconduct is also increasing. So this is increasingly a dilemma that firms and a conundrum that firms are going to have to face in practice and think about in practice. It doesn't, as I say, often lend itself to easy solutions. But it's important that firms get it right, balance the right sort of interests, strike those right types of balances, okay, often delicate balances, and ensure that at the end of the day that they've struck that balance as best they could.
And I think that's a good note and moment to thank you all very much for those insights. And thank you for listening to this episode in our Connected with Latham podcast series. You can subscribe and listen to new and archived episodes of Latham's podcasts on lw.com, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. If you'd like more information about the topics in this podcast, please email us from the links located in the show description. In particular, if you'd like a copy of the framework, please email us from the link in the show notes. We hope you'll join us again next time.
This podcast is provided as a service of Latham & Watkins LLP. Listening to this podcast does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and Latham & Watkins LLP, and you should not send confidential information to Latham & Watkins LLP. While we make every effort to assure that the content of this podcast is accurate, comprehensive, and current, we do not warrant or guarantee any of those things. And you may not rely on this podcast as a substitute for legal research and/or consulting a qualified attorney. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for engaging a lawyer to advise you on your individual needs. Should you require legal advice on the issues covered in this podcast, please consult a qualified attorney. Under New York's Code of Professional Responsibility, portions of this communication contain attorney advertising. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Results depend upon a variety of factors unique to each representation. Please direct all inquiries regarding the conduct of Latham & Watkins attorneys under the New York's disciplinary rules to Latham & Watkins LLP, 885 3rd Avenue, New York, New York, 10022-4834. Phone number 1-212-906-1200.